Are there certain foods that will be associated with you eating more food over time, taking in more calories? And are there some that are associated with eating less? Well, at Diet Doctor, we think the answer is yes, and that's why we're really starting to focus on higher satiety eating and how that can fit into any type of eating pattern, including low-carb and ketogenic diets, which still certainly have their own role. But for those who don't want to eat low-carb or keto, or even those who do, focusing on higher satiety foods could help some people improve healthy weight loss and improve their overall health. And a new study just came out that sort of supports this, so I want to talk about that. Let's get into the detail. I'm Dr. Brett Scher, the medical director at dietdoctor.com, and this study is called Effect of Different Food Groups on Energy Intake Within and Between Individuals, and was published in the European Journal of Nutrition. Now, this study, one caveat, it is an observational study, right? So a little bit lower level quality of evidence for sure, not a randomized controlled trial. But what they did was they had survey data from over 6,100 people in the UK, adults over 19 years old, and they were free living in the real world, self-reporting. And that's important because in their introduction, they talked about how, in metabolic ward studies and where you control all the food intake, that's one type of evidence, but they wanted to complement that with real world evidence. And I think this is important, right? They're not saying this is the end-all be-all study, this is the highest level of evidence, but they're saying this complements other areas of evidence, and they talk about how it's important to have both. So that's really interesting. Now, of course, anytime you're self-reporting, there's a huge variation in sort of the reliability of that. Also, it was just for 4 days that they did the self-report, and they looked at energy intake within the day, right? So they looked at if you ate certain foods, how that changed your energy intake within that day. So it's a short-term study, observational, right? Those are caveats, but it still adds to our knowledge on the subject. And they recognize how the science up to this point supports higher fiber, higher protein, lower energy density, that those are associated with decreased calorie intake, and that higher carbs and higher fats are associated with higher energy intake, right? And this is for general public average diet. And so they wanted to see how their study fit into that body of literature. So what they did was they took everybody's food survey and they separated the food intake into 60 categories of food. So obviously there's more than 60 categories of food in the world, but these are pretty good, right? To try and group them into specific categories as best they can. And then they measured the energy intake for each day. And then they did a whole bunch of regression analyses to sort of correlate if you had more of one certain food, what did that mean for your total calorie intake? And in general, though, it was a, average kind of standard American, standard European high carb diet. There was 32% fat, 17% protein, and about 50% carbs. So definitely not low carb eating, but the data is what the data is, and so we can interpret it within this context and then debate whether it applies to other certain specific situations. And in the end, the data does seem to correlate with lower energy density, higher fiber, higher protein, being sort of the better foods in terms of being correlated or associated with decreased caloric intake. Now, the caveat here is since it's not an intervention, it could be just that, healthier people who eat fewer calories eat more of those types of foods. So that is the caveat, but it does seem to support that. So interestingly, skim milk was kind of number one in terms of associated with decreased calorie intake, and the same for diet soda. So those two were kind of interesting, and those could be part of the associative, the associated confounding variables, because people who are going to focus on skim milk or diet sodas may be more likely to be trying to lose weight and eat fewer calories. But at the same time, the sugar-sweetened beverages was one of the worst ones to do, right? And was associated with the highest energy intake, which is interesting because that kind of goes against the energy density part of it, right? The liquids tend to have less energy density, but sugar-sweetened beverages, smoothies, fruit juices, those were correlated with the highest amount of energy intake. So that's where the old saying of don't drink your calories really sort of shines in this study, that those who did drink their calories had the highest association of eating more calories. Some of the other good, quote-unquote, good foods that were associated with less calorie intake were whitefish, shellfish, and fish dishes, high-fiber breakfast cereals, potatoes, beef and veal dishes, and lamb dishes, oily fish, chicken and turkey dishes, right? So right away, we're seeing the concepts of higher protein, higher fiber, and sort of lower energy density as well. Although surprisingly, vegetables were a little bit lower down on the list, but still pretty decent. But then on the very bottom, no surprises, sugar preserves and sweet spreads, margarine and oils, reduced fat spread, soft drinks that, were sugar-sweetened beverages, milk and cream, so sort of high-fat milk and cream, butter, margarines, fat and oils, wine, fruit juice. So it's consistent with, again, energy density, fiber, and protein, which is what we're using at Diet Doctor for our satiety calculations. All of our recipes now have satiety scores. And we have a satiety calculator we're working on that will help you make decisions based on satiety. Now, but here's the big question. Does this apply to all diets the same? And this study certainly does not answer that question. One of the debates that always comes up is, well, I'm eating oil and butter and cream and high-fat yogurt and high-fat foods on my ketogenic diet, and I am losing weight and improving my metabolic health. So there does appear to be sort of a caveat to all this data that if you're following a low-carb ketogenic diet, these higher energy density, higher fat foods that tend to be lower satiety per calorie in some of these studies may not have the same, I guess you could say, detrimental effect for increased caloric intake, right? Because ketogenic diet studies show that frequently that people will naturally reduce their calorie intake. Now, at the same time, their protein tends to go up in those studies, but so does some of their, you could say, lower satiety foods. But the other thing is, a lot of times people are swapping out the breads, the pastas, the pizzas, the ice cream for these lower carb versions of lower satiety foods. So maybe that's a more beneficial transition. But I think it's clear, if you are hitting all your health markers and your weight loss goals and you're feeling great and your blood work is great, your blood pressure is great, your metabolic health is great, and you're following a higher fat ketogenic diet that doesn't have some of these, that does have some of these lower satiety foods, but your hunger is well controlled, all right, then you've done your own N of 1 experiment, right? These are all on a bell curve, and we can't say that this applies to everybody. But for anybody who's struggling to hit all those markers, or maybe who hasn't succeeded with a ketogenic diet, or maybe doesn't want to try a ketogenic diet for whatever reason, or is still struggling with improving their health and their weight loss, or controlling their hunger, then following this type of a pattern or this type of framework of higher satiety eating can be extremely beneficial. We've experienced it from a clinical standpoint. The evidence seems to support it, and this is sort of one more piece of the puzzle with this real-world observational study to combine with the shorter-term interventional trials that suggest the same characteristics of higher protein, lower energy density, higher fiber, and of course, lower sugar and hedonic factors as well. Now, there might be caveats as to the degree of that, right? When we say higher protein, do we mean 90%, protein percentage is better than 30%? Well, no, probably not, right? We know that the curve eventually levels out, and that the real bang for the buck, so to speak, for a protein is to go from low protein, 5, 10, 15% protein to like the 20, 25, 30% protein. And after that, it sort of flattens out with maybe, some small added benefits going beyond that. But the main focus should be on that like 20 to 30% protein. And same for fiber, right? If you're getting 30, 40, 50 grams of fiber, do you have to push it to 100, 150? No. I mean, that's when you're going to start to really run into GI problems probably. But so the key is, though, foods that are sort of naturally high in fiber, naturally higher in protein, and naturally lower in energy density are likely going to be better for your satiety. And you can fit that into your dietary program or your way of eating. All right, so hopefully this was helpful. It's an interesting study that just lends more support for these concepts. And you go to dietdoctor.com and check out all our content about higher satiety eating and see if it applies to you and if it can help you on your healthy weight loss journey. Thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you here next time on Diet Doctor News on YouTube.